where I had somebody who came up to me, and I'm sure a great person, like a wonderful person. It was a Ukrainian American in Cleveland, Ohio. I was campaigning for the Senate. There are a lot of Ukrainian Americans in Cleveland, Ohio. And this person got really agitated at me because I was saying we should stop funding the Ukraine war, okay? And I still believe that, obviously, and it's one of the things I'm proudest that we've done as administration is we've told Europe that if you want to buy weapons, you can, but the United States is not buying weapons and sending them to Ukraine anymore.
Ronald Reagan ran his first term for president. It's hard to be more of a Republican than me. From day one, I was very leery of Trump. He was the only one who was an apologist for Putin. I think that's very important for Ukrainians to understand.
Бо наша воля, то є наша кров, повітря нашої сили джерело, свободи сонце більше не зайде, і Україна була, є й буде.
Hello, welcome to the Talking Ukraine podcast. So today my guest is George Woloshyn. George has a very multifaceted career. He's currently retired, but he's still active in Ukrainian philanthropy. I know him probably from his contributions, first and foremost, to the Kyiv Post over the years. He's written many articles. I'm just going to read from the Kyiv Post, George, your brief bio here, and then you can tell us more about yourself.
Sure.
George Woloshyn is a retired senior executive and Senate-confirmed presidential appointee in the Reagan administration. He had served as head of government-wide civilian personnel security, national security, emergency preparedness, and as inspector general of a regulatory agency. He has also been active in philanthropic programs involving Ukraine. You've sent me your resume. I mean, you've done a lot more than that. You have quite an interesting career, but maybe, just for people listening here, what do you think, in Talking Ukraine, what do you think would be relevant and interesting for people to know about you and maybe even start, like were you born in Ukraine and came during World War II?
Yeah. I was born in a small village in Ukraine called Kuknovice. My parents came over when I was 3 years old, came over to the United States. They were like most of the post-World War II diaspora. They stayed a year or two in DP camps and then were accepted into the United States. So almost all my life, starting around the age 3 or 4, was brought up in the United States.
You grew up in what part of the United States? That you were in Plost with my father. So what was your upbringing like, and where did you grow up? Because you're currently in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Right.
Well, I grew up, we lived up first in Manhattan, which is the usual sort of gateway for immigrants to the United States. We then moved up to the Bronx. I went to Fordham Prep and Fordham Law School, which I'm pretty much of a Fordham guy. A few years at St. George in the very beginning when we were living in Manhattan. After I graduated the law school, and I also picked up an MBA at the City University of New York, Bernard Baruch Graduate School of Business. I went into the service. Vietnam was going on at the time. I really would have wanted to go abroad because I was fascinated by what was going on. And being a young fellow, I thought I could really go ahead and kick a little bit of communist infiltrators out of South Vietnam. So I was kind of looking forward to it. I went into the Army, served in the reserve until the Reagan administration, and he was building up the U.S. Navy at the time. So I switched over to Naval Reserves, and I had been in the Army Reserves all that time, other than my 2 years of active duty. And then we moved down to Virginia after I got my law degree. Moved down to Maryland, stayed a little while in Maryland near Washington. Moved over to Virginia, Falls Church area, and from here essentially we in this general area, and now I'm trying to keep keep up with developments in Ukraine, trying to keep up with what's going on. My main interest, as far as what I want to do in the remainder of the years that God would bless me with, I really would like to have make a contribution towards what I consider will be the new Ukraine, a Ukraine that will have largely rid itself of oligarchs working strongly to curtail and get rid of corruption. In other words, a government that really cares for its people. And I would very much like to have some role in that, even though I feel that with every passing week or month, maybe my hold on reality will diminish. But I still would like to at least feel that I can make some contribution based upon my government service. That's where I am, and that's why I'm waiting for the war to end. My wife and I pray every day for peace, but peace only if it's advantageous to Ukraine, and hopefully be able to involve myself a little bit both in the campaign in Ukraine by joining up with some of the people that I feel will be a great benefit to Ukraine and are needed very badly, and be able to help them a little bit gain their positions, and perhaps be able from there to be able to do whatever I can in my remaining years that God has awarded me.
Yeah,
that's it. Nothing particularly exciting.
Well, you've been, I guess, involved in Ukraine probably since independence in various ways, and if not writing, visiting there and making connections. Have you seen the evolution of Ukraine from your perspective? I mean, because sometimes it felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as the years have gone on, from the Kuchma to Yushchenko to Yanukovych. And corruption has been such a has been the main issue, I guess, until the Russian invasion and interference, which was always there, but just a lot more subtly. But how have you seen, in your time visiting Ukraine, paying attention to Ukraine, the progression of society, in these 30 years of independence?
Damien, I'll tell you, I probably had been in Ukraine as early as you have after its independence. 1994, 1995, I'm not quite sure of the year, I headed up a delegation from the Clinton White House to Ukraine to a symposium, which I also orchestrated, both on the U.S. side and on the Ukrainian side, a symposium called Government Ethics and Accountability. Now, as you can imagine, a topic like that is not one that the government of Ukraine would readily publicize for its citizens to come and listen to, because it was still largely a legacy government. They were still very leery of foreigners, Ukrainian diaspora. I think there were still many people who were anticipating that Ukraine would have a reapproachment with Russia, and would unite in some fashion and move forward in that way. So for a person like me, with a delegation which consisted of senior officials, executive level appointees, I myself was an executive level appointee at the time, so I had a little bit of influence with the State Department and the Clinton White House, even though I was a Republican. But the White House was very much interested in building up good relations with Ukraine, particularly because Ukraine was in the process of depriving itself of nuclear weapons.
I was just about to ask you, was this around the time of the Budapest Memorandum? Yeah.
Yeah. So I basically, from there on in, I began going to Ukraine quite frequently. I'll tell you, I retired early in my life. I could have continued in my role as Inspector General much longer into my life career than I did. But I really wanted not to be restricted by workplace employment, hours of employment at a job. I wanted to be free to go to Ukraine and see if I could find interested U.S. investors. Again, at that time, I was really not in favor of philanthropy in Ukraine because I felt that, according to the old story, you can either teach somebody to catch fish or you can give them fish. Well, I wanted to be the one who would be bringing in some investment so that people could have jobs. It was a very difficult time in Ukraine. You probably remember it. People eating out of garbage cans. I remember one particularly sorrowful sight of an elderly Ukrainian opera singer, beautiful, beautiful voice. She was singing. She was sitting in the on the concrete floor of Hreschatик subway, and she was singing continuously again and again Ave Maria, while she had a little basket in front of her looking for anybody to throw in some change. And I was thinking to myself, what a tragedy, what lovely people, what talented people. I went down on the artist corner of Ukraine. I looked at some of the paintings. I spoke to people, how intelligent they were. I went over to the Independence Square, where, as you may recall, there were quite a few assemblages of various Ukrainian citizens who were going there just to be able to hear various speakers and also introduce their thoughts. What I heard from them was so much more intelligent, well-read, knowledgeable than I found anywhere in the United States. I'll be quite honest with you. I saw a very educated, widely read population, very interested in what was going on, good thoughts, coherent, even if misinformed concepts and philosophies. But the point is that it was clear to me that here was a nation that finally, after centuries of repression, persecution, abuse, exploitation, anything you want, nevertheless had the courage and the heroism of putting up with several years of privation during the transition from a Soviet state to one that increasingly was able to get its economy going and so on. And I wanted very badly to do whatever I could to help them. I wasn't in the least bit interested in actually benefiting from it. My pensions were sufficient to be able to allow my wife and me and my daughters, who were still going to school or starting careers, to be able to get by. So I wasn't interested in any of that. But I was interested simply in seeing how many American investors I could bring to Ukraine. The problem, Damien, was simply this. At that time, Ukraine was in the very midst of what's called the Wild West part of the Ukrainian transition, which means, in essence, that whoever had a few dollars of hard currency and who was tied in or could be tied in with the mafia, with the organized crime criminals throughout Ukraine, could go ahead and sell off any assets that were then available, because there was always a seller, whether it was a government bureaucrat trying to get a commission on some corrupt act, or a legacy director of a company who had some products and was willing to sell it for a song and a dance if he could get the money immediately. It was very sad. I saw cows, Ukrainian cows and herds, being sold to Italian shoemakers at $1 a cow, simply in order to get their skins and make shoes out of them, and so forth. One of the biggest sellers in Ukraine were sellers who were selling military supplies, AK-47s, anything you wanted, tanks, airplanes, aircraft carriers, as you well know, they sold one to China. So, when I saw all that, I thought to myself, gee, if everything is so inexpensive and people are so smart, and Ukraine is such a uniquely blessed and gifted country, this ought to be a Klondike for American investors who want to make their money legitimately, set up factories or buy existing factories, modernize them, go into production, hire Ukrainians, and from there on in, a whole generation growing who becomes familiar with Western technology, Western marketing, and so forth. It was a joke. It was a joke because I went there in a very serious and trusting fashion, and found that the people that I was dealing with inevitably were not the ones who could make any decisions. They could simply refer me to the capo di capi, who was going to decide whether or not they want to sell something or buy something, and what the price would be. And of course, if you made the mistake of being able to actually negotiate a deal, good chance of being killed if there was any kind of profits or money to be made from any kind of enterprise. So I went into more the philanthropic vein, and by that I mean largely my own money. I started a small fundraising organization during my second Maidan. By the way, I attended both Maidans. I was there for a week to 10 days, both in the first and the second Maidan. Out there demonstrating with the populace. In fact, in the second Maidan, I think I had the distinction of having the only American flag in the assemblage of several hundred thousands of people. Some exciting times. Obviously, I had family obligations at home. Most of my philanthropic work started out in a semi-religious type of projects. When I'm talking about semi-religious projects, my interest was half on the religious side and half on the secular side. And by that, what I mean is, like, for example, the whole question of abortions. I saw the prevalence of abortions in Ukraine, which at that time, as a Catholic, I had a real animus towards abortions, primarily because of the fact that these were God's children whose life were being snuffed in the womb. That's what an abortion is all about. Real creatures, real Ukrainians to be, a generation of Ukrainians, many of which were being killed simply because parents could not afford them. So I learned about a natural family planning. I saw it as a very viable alternative to parents who could not afford children. But natural family planning simply meant that if they forbore by maybe a few days a month from sexual intimacy, they would not be running the risk of giving life to a child whose life would have to be snuffed even before that child was able to breathe freely. Then I supported an initiative with an organization called Caritas in Drohobych for another major problem, and that's the problem of divorces, broken marriages, broken families, fathers and mothers going abroad to Europe to make a living, and leaving their children to the attention of a maybe alcoholic grandmother or aunt or whoever. So I thought in many small way of trying to rectify, or I should rather say, beginning a prospect of rectifying, a growing prospect of rectifying this problem. Couples knew how to the problems of raising families and how to cope with each other in their marital relationships instead of everybody just deciding to get a divorce or to leave and call it quits. I thought to myself, if there was a way of teaching people how to hold marriages together, how to take care of children, what to anticipate in terms of problems of their young people. If I could set up an institute, that institute would be able to go out, would teach others, and these other people would be able then to counsel. So we did set up an institute for family relations with Caritas in Drohobych. Caritas in Drohobych, by the way, and I would like you and everybody who's listening in to know that it is an a very extraordinary site.
At any rate, year are we talking about here? Like what's the time?
Going to Drohobych and helping them with all these projects was going back about 15 years, looking back 15 years. And my very last trip was this past late autumn, early winter. I went to Kyiv, an organization, to take food from local farmers, from whoever would contribute. And they were getting regular supplies of food. And I saw like farmers pulling up with a small truck and dropping off several bushels of turnips or potatoes, and then we would take it up to the kitchen, and then slice it up, peel it, slice it up, and so on. Feed it through a machine that cut it into thin slices and put those slices into a series of heating grids, where they were heated and then put into plastic bags as for meals, whether it was breakfast or borscht or cookies or what have you. And then these were sent out by drone to be flying over the military frontline, Ukrainian frontline positions, so that was one way for them to get the food, which otherwise would have been very dangerous if they had regular shipments of food coming across an area in which obviously Russia had its drones. So that is still a going operation, and is very successful. And I was working in the kitchen with everybody else, peeling potatoes, helping out, kneading flour.
So basically, I mean, I just want to frame this a little bit. So you know, you're what, 81 now, right? Is that you're 82. So you know, I found this article. Local man heads back to Ukraine to support war relief efforts. So you've been going, I guess, every year since the war started, and basically doing this sort of manual labor charity work in Ukraine. So you know,
it's got to be done. And I'll tell you, it's got to be done. And I was very fortunate in that I had people who were equally adamant and committed. It's such a joy. You know, one of the reasons why I've kind of stayed a little bit away from the diaspora, but I regret it now. But I've stayed a little bit away from the diaspora most of my life because I was a little bit disenchanted with the kind of what I thought I saw as kind of lackadaisical attitudes that people had. You know, life was good and there were a lot of other things to do in the West other than worry about Ukraine. But I was wrong. You know, when I look upon the degree of involvement and the degree of sacrifice, both financial sacrifice and working and so on, that the diaspora has put out, and the continuing influence that they're having on various congressmen and senators, particularly if there's any kind of a sizable Ukrainian community, I'm thinking to myself, I've been very wrong. If I had been a little bit more humble and a little bit less critical, I probably would have joined the effort and maybe have been much more capable of helping than I did as a voluntary solo.
Yeah. There's definitely sometimes it's tough to work with people, but if you can get things done, you can have a bigger impact.
Sure.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Just to get a little into the politics, this article that I saw it, I think, on Facebook, and there were some comments from, MAGA Republicans saying, oh, we should just focus on, George should focus on helping America first. We shouldn't be spending resources there. Like, there were a couple comments like that, and you're sort of like a lifelong Republican. And I'm curious how you're dealing with this sort of MAGA takeover of the Republican Party. Is there this lifelong conflicts with going on? Like, what are the dynamics from your perspective with that?
I was the first to set up a conservative club at Fordham College when I was in college there. They didn't have a conservative club, but there was a trend towards the younger people, especially at Fordham College, which is a pretty conservative college, to take an interest in more or less the center-right, general spectrum of ideologies. And my loyalty to the Republican Party continued from that day until Bush. Okay, it was one of the reasons why I chose a career in which able to work with Republicans who were interested in trying to bring over what we refer to as blue collar ethnics. You were probably a bit too young, but there was a period of time where most of the blue collar ethnics, in other words, the hardworking Catholic, Italian, and what have you, they were generally considered to be a captive constituency for the Democrat Party. Since I was a strong conservative, I knew I was a conservative, in almost everything that I read and did, not did, but read. So I was pretty well in the conservative Republican stew. They didn't have to worry about me. I set up an organization of Americans for Freedom, which was kind of a group interested in uniting Americans of East European origin, and Cubans were thrown in for good measure because obviously they also found themselves under communism in Russia. When Ronald Reagan ran his first term for president, what I did was I went out and I looked at the census statistics in various states, and I added up the numbers of Americans who had registered themselves as being of Polish or Lithuanian or Hungarian or Cuban origin, and so forth, based upon the census. And I laid out a plan for the Republicans to use in terms of recognizing that the ethnic, the so-called blue-collar ethnic, could make the decisive difference between many significant states with a lot of electoral college votes. If they could get the blue-collar ethnic constituency, which was socially conservative, but politically liberal because the Democrats were catering to them, but then the Republicans had this, kept their nose up in the air with all these dirty migrants, quote, end of quote. And so the Democrats were able very early, the moment they stepped off the boat, were able to invite them to come over and to become a Democrat and to become a local Democrat leader and mobilize others. The Republicans never did that. That's why they never, even though these were socially conservative, they were never able to really get them to in an organized fashion. Ronald Reagan ran his second time and won his first and then his second term. He was prepared because we had an opportunity to be able to ensure that he would also be addressing the East European communities. We set up a special contingent within the Republican campaign, which would be going out and, for example, wherever there was an ethnic publication, we had some letter from, at that time, a candidate, Reagan, congratulating them on their Independence Day or on some special event. They even, whenever they went into a city which had a sizable Ukrainian constituency, they were met with young Ukrainian girls giving them bread, and of course, I even wrote an article which Ronald Reagan commended me for, and he said that it opened his eyes on something that he hadn't been aware of. I wrote an article in a publication called Human Events, called "Will the USSR Survive Till 1984?" And Ronald Reagan commended me because he said, I never realized that there was really an ethnic issue in the Soviet Union. I never knew that there were all these nationalities, Baltic states, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, and so on, that really were unhappy being a part of the Soviet Union. Forget about communism, but this was another area of perspective, cracks in the monolith. And so he said this was the first time that I really opened my eyes to this issue, because up to that time it was communism versus the free market. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Whether you think it's just a illusion that they're separate or not, it was there. Anyway, for whatever it's worth, those were moments that I can value, that I may have contributed in some fashion.
Yeah. And how does it, tie back to, today's Republican Party and these Republican MAGAs saying like, no, George, you shouldn't be focusing your energy and we, America, shouldn't be focusing our energy and attention towards Ukraine, right? Like there's a section within that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, like if John McCain were president when the war started, things would have gone a lot differently, right?
When Trump came along, I'll tell you right now, I was very leery of Trump. Even though Trump, he was, I think he spent 2 years at Fordham, at least a year, and possibly 2 years at Fordham, and he was probably a year or two above the class that I was in at the time at Fordham College.
Oh.
His reputation, and especially if you read his niece's book, she described him as the worst disaster that the U.S. and the globe will have to contend with. In other words, a niece who saw her uncle in terms of the kind of person he really was, basically a sociopath. And she has a doctorate in psychology, so she knows the difference between a sociopath and a normal person. But from the very beginning, I was very leery of Trump from day one. When I heard him on his very first entree into politics, that was when he was one of about 11 or 12 other Republican candidates. He was the only one who was an apologist for Putin. And so from that day, I had deep suspicions as to what the guy was all about. And those suspicions lingered to today, so that I completely broke my ties with the Republican conservatives who are now finding Trump to be a reasonable alternative. I wanted nothing to do with them. There was nothing and in fact, in this last election, there was a video that was cut of me by an anti-Trump video in which I was talking about the enormous danger Trump posed in terms of his completely negligible approach to classified information, especially information at a very high level. So yes, and in fact, I voted Democrat since then. I don't care who the Democrat was. They could be a socialist. But as far as I'm concerned, the number one priority for any Ukrainian in the United States is to support somebody who will support Ukraine. And I'll tell you why. Because that issue is so important to the United States that you, as an American citizen who understands the seriousness of that issue, should go out there and try to do everything you can towards making sure that Trump does not get elected or reelected. The same is true for Vance, by the way. I think that's very important for Ukrainians to understand.
Yeah, for me, it's sort of strange that all the Republican Party is just sort of like accepting, whatever way the wind turns on that particular day, Trump Day, whatever he says, they just sort of go along with it, including a lot of Ukrainian Americans who voted for him, some of which maybe have changed their minds, but some of which still seem to support him. And I don't quite understand that, because he's never said a critical word about Putin or Russia, but somehow they're like these mental gymnastics going on where they still think that behind the scenes he's working against Russia and to support Ukraine. And I don't understand, I guess, the spell that like you say, it's pretty clear, right? But there's still people in the Ukrainian American community which don't see it so clearly, and I'm, maybe because they've been lifelong Republicans, and it's hard for them to step out of that box. I don't know. Like, do you have any colleagues or friends or any insights into that?
Look, it's hard to be more of a Republican than me. One of the positions that I had was that of Director of National Preparedness, which is Associate Director for FEMA. That was an extremely sensitive position. National preparedness meaning, if the balloon goes up, what should the United States, how the United States should be prepared? That was during the Reagan administration, when the possibility of a real conflict was there. In fact, I doubt very much whether there are any Ukrainians who have had an executive level 4 appointment. There shouldn't be any question as to, complete FBI check, polygraphs, the whole 9 yards. There shouldn't be any question as to my loyalties. But as far as I'm concerned, if you're Ukrainian, you know a great deal more, or should know a great deal more, about what your significance Ukraine is in the overall geopolitical sphere. And you should realize that if Ukraine goes down, either the U.S. is drawn into a war on behalf of NATO, or it turns its back and let the Russians pretty much dominate Europe. In either instance, the United States is a loser, and a major loser. To me, I was less fearful of the Democrats, including their left-wing position on a number of issues, took a pro-Ukrainian position throughout. If you remember, whenever there never was a Democratic congressman or senator who said that we should stop supporting Ukraine. Some may have been a little bit more vocal, some a little bit less vocal, but to me, that's the bottom line. Not so much what you think or whatever, but how you vote in Congress. Do you support Ukraine, or are you in favor of some sort of accommodation in which Ukraine will have to give up something that it has absolutely no reason to give up? And in fact, I think that every American should be thanking every Ukrainian American for the very fact that we have been supporting a country that at a tiny cost to the U.S., and we're looking only at about $150 billion. That's even a small fraction of the defense budget, annual defense budget. We've been able to basically show that the emperor has no clothes. And the emperor, if he keeps on doing what he's doing, is probably going to end up suing for peace because Ukrainians have held up so long. So we are entitled to a huge debt of gratitude from every American and European that Ukraine has stood guard at the gate, even though they were begging and borrowing wherever they could, simply to keep the guns shooting. I can't see anybody supporting if a Republican has been outspoken in defense of Ukraine, as some have against the wishes of the majority of their party, I will be the first to support them. Right now, I've been sending money to Vindeman in Florida. He's running for Senate. And I've sent him a few $100 because I think whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, now he's running on the Democrat ticket, but whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, he represents somebody who understands what Ukraine is all about and is going to do the right thing by this country. Every Republican who is neutral or soft on the issue and willing to go along and be friends with Putin and with Russia, to me, they're simply ignorant people, and they're buying illusions rather than reality.
What?
Did I answer your question?
Yeah. What? I mean, what for? Those people, like, what is at stake for? Where like this common MAGA response is like, it's not our war, it's not our business, this is far away. Like, what is at stake? And if you had the ear of whoever was president, like, what would you advise them to end this war? Like, how do you think it can end in a sustainable peace for Ukraine? Any thoughts about that?
The first question I would ask is, how much do you know about Eastern Europe, about Russia, about Ukraine? If you're making these assertions that we shouldn't be there, it's not in our interest, why do you think it's not in our interest? Simply because it's on the other side of the ocean? Is that it? Do we have any interest in the world that are not on the other side of the ocean? And those interests are not necessarily simply financial, economic interests, but those interests involve basically preserving countries from domination by an imperialistic, brutal, alien force that is looking to dominate those countries. And not only that, but once they gain domination, they'll be coming after us. So you're not going to escape it, just like you may not be interested in politics, but politics is very interested in you. And you may not be interested in what's going on in between Russia and Ukraine, but Mr. Putin is very much interested in you. And if you had half a brain, you would support Ukraine to the hills, because it's costing you virtually nothing. And yet Ukraine is taking the brunt of destroying this monster before it spreads. And if they're Catholic, I would tell them point blank, I would say, look, the Blessed Virgin at Fatima said, I mean, very clearly, she said that unless the world improved and made amends for all the wrong that they were doing, Russia would spread its evils throughout the world. She didn't say communism. She didn't say, atheists or anything like that. She said Russia. And that was already at Fatima, where communism was already a very, very significant factor in terms of the future of that area of the world. And I think we're living through that moment where Russia will spread its evils. The only question is, she also, in that prophecy, she also made it clear that it's not going to be good. It's not going to be good for the rest of mankind, because the rest of mankind had to do something to get their act together. In other words, to stop being as demoralized, as immoral, as money hungry, and so forth as they are. The Blessed Virgin saw Russia as spreading its evils around the world. And if you're a Catholic, and if you at all give credence to what the Blessed Virgin has to say, all you have to do is see the amount of explosives that they are using against Ukrainian civilians. When the Ukrainian armed forces go out of their way to stay away from any area where there could be civilians who may be hurt. When they throw drones and missiles at the Russians, they do it strictly at facilities or factories that are involved in the war effort. They're not looking to terrorize the population and cause them misery. Ukraine still follows the noble convention of wars, where wars are to be fought among armed men, not against innocent, vulnerable civilians, women, and children. So if they look upon Russia...
But you know this, and I know this, and people who follow events in Ukraine know this, but for like the casual American, they're fed this narrative of like Russia as some protector of traditional Christian values. And like, it seems that projection as Ukraine is corrupt, Russia as the protector of traditional values has like penetrated a segment of American society successfully. I mean, it's absurd to me, but like there's people who genuinely like believe this. It seems to me. Look.
Russia is just one big illusion. They probably have had more success by starting very early, starting back in the 16th, 17th century, with putting a major emphasis on disinformation, while other countries never even thought about that as a suitable form of intrusion and invasion and infiltration, And they started doing it with Peter the First, who stole Ukraine's name from Ukraine, who was known as Rush, stole it and drafted it onto an empire, which at that time was called the Empire of Muscovy Suzdal or Muscovy or Suzdal or whatever, but it was not called Russia. He stole the name because he wanted to draft onto that miserable little land. He wanted to draft on the glorious heritage of Kiev during the 9th and 10th and 11th century. Otherwise, they have nothing. They have Ivan the Terrible going forward. That's not much of a legacy to draw on. But there are some people you simply are not going to convince. I'll tell you why. They are so deeply committed, or have been so deeply committed, that for them to suddenly change their mind, as I have, and said, okay, I believe them, and I went along with them, and I paid my dues to them at a time when they were on the right track. Now they went off track, and I have no further reason to be loyal to them if they're going to take a course which is detrimental to the interests of the world, and that includes the United States. And it's detrimental to the interest of the world to see Russia make headway and gain in this particular battle with Ukraine. So to me, I have no problem saying, okay, I was right then because the party I was supporting was right. And I'm right now in that I'm now against the party that has taken the wrong course. It's like you're going on a hiking trail, and you run into a road where you and the person you're with are now debating which one to take. He takes one course, and you go on the one that you're sure is the one that should be taken. Were you wrong in diverging, and then in saying, go your own way? Whatever you want to do, I have no longer any responsibility to you as a fellow traveler.
Yeah.
And a little bit of a political should be appealing to some of the Democratic constituents. But the point is that the whole Christian thing is just nonsense. We know it is, and all you have to do is to point out to him that that they have a patriarch who is a KGB agent, who is one of the richest men in Europe, who owns pretty much the monopoly over import of tobacco, and who drives around with in expensive cars and Rolls Royces, and fully supports the Putin, including blessing the missiles that are headed at Ukraine to destroy Ukrainian kids, and even urging the troops to go on and to kill Ukrainians as being God's. How can you possibly assume that either he or the person that he's serving, Putin, have any Christian morality or concerns about anything? So, and believe me, look, until recently, this is the area in which I live is pretty pro-Trump, but there's even a more conservative area that's even more pro-Trump, in the area where I used to live, which is in the Front Royal area, which is about 25 miles from here. There's also a very, very strong Catholic constituency, very traditional, I should say, traditional and strong, really living their faith. And let me tell you, I've had some serious arguments with some of these Catholics who said, well, but I know that Putin is talking about the degradation and depravities in the West, and he's right. And he's against abortion. He's only against abortion only because he wants to make sure that Russia doesn't shrink to a little country where it can't control this 11 time zone empire that it sits on right now. That's his only reason. Otherwise, he's concerned about human life. Well, why don't you take a little interest in some of the people that you're sending in the front lines? They're going in there with crutches and in wheelchairs to the front lines. Why don't you pull them back, rehabilitate them, and give them a life instead of just sending them into the meat grinder? In other words, but they even won't look at the reality. They won't even look. If I tell them, why don't you go to so and so source? Oh, that's mainstream media. Oh no, they've been lying to us. You see, the biggest problem right now for the U.S. is basically this: there is no longer a body of factual, credible information that everybody agrees on. There are no longer anchor person who knew that every word they were saying, it better be right, because if they started tilting it too much, now, there was a tilt. I used to drive around Washington years back with a bumper sticker saying, I don't believe the Washington Post. Now, the Washington Post, to me, is a paper I go to when I want to really find out what's going on somewhere. But there was a time when there was a very specific tilt off towards the left, and I simply wasn't so sure that everything I was reading was well balanced and was objective. But fine, so they had a little tilt to the left. But they did still include, what they did include was real, except maybe they included more of the reality of this than of that, okay? But it still was real, it still was credible. Now you don't even have that, because every time you have a Wall Street Journal or New York Times or an Atlanta, I read it in the newspaper, they say, oh, you believe that stuff? Yeah, why don't you go to this source and you'll get a completely different. How do you
There's no consensus on what is true. Everyone's in their own echo chamber, and if there's something that's outside of that echo chamber, they're not open to even consider it.
Exactly.
It's a big problem.
And I refuse to simply conform to whatever happened to be in that echo chamber, or be a Minuteman who put the finger in the air to see which way the winds are coming from. I never was disappointed in my support for Ukraine, regardless of how many people walked away with distaste. Fact that I refuse to buy into the MAGA. And look, they're still calling me. I mean, it's been years that I've had any dealings at all with the Republican Party, and they're still calling me and texting me and giving me a deadline of today at midnight, or you will forever lose your seat in the Republican Party. I don't know what seat I ever had. probably there's some bright people there. But they're ignorant people. They're the same kind of people who always seem to jump on a train that's moving forward, even if they don't know where their train is going. Okay, but at least it's moving. And these are the kind of people who feel that MAGA is moving, and all the rest that's being left behind. That's old stuff. For senior citizens like me too.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah. Well, it seems like we might be hitting a wall of reality within the MAGA movement, like now or soon, or Well, it'll be interesting what happens over the next couple of months. Hopefully, Ukraine can hold out with the support of Europe, because it seems like that's what they need to do. Do you have any thoughts about the future, predictions for the future? I mean, looking forward from where we are today, and how can how can Ukrainians get back to their lives and advancing their society and living in peace? I don't know. Any thoughts towards the future generally?
Damien, I really do think, and it's not only applicable to Ukraine, but it's applicable to a lot of other societies. When you've gone through a tremendously traumatic experience in a war, you come out of it different than when you went in. And a lot of societies have shown that. Look at the Germans. It's so hard to even get the Germans to even think about joining the military. And the thing is that Ukrainians will come out of this war. First of all, there will be very few Ukrainians left who are going to buy into anything that the Russians want to promote to them, because they will immediately look upon it as nothing other than more Russian lies. And that's very important, because until the war, a lot of Ukrainians were still prepared to read Russian news, listen to Russian TV, and so on. And the Russians have become very good at using modern communication devices, TVs, and so on, instead of being dull, like the communist system had, dull, gray, uninteresting, routine. They've pepped it up so much that they're just as interesting as a lot of Western programs are. Secondly, there's no longer going to be any question as to what is the national language and pride in the national language, and extensive, expansive usage of the national language. So everything that the Russians would have wanted to see in Ukraine, they're not going to see. You don't have to be in the military in order to be tremendously useful to Ukrainians in their fights, okay? Like I think I was tremendously useful in getting food to frontline troops. And if I hadn't been around, as well as half a dozen or a dozen truly impressive foreigners who came, including one Ukrainian who came from Washington, the state of Washington, or Oregon. There was a Mormon from Utah who owns a fleet of trucks in Utah, who was so determined to help Ukraine that he will be coming back again. It's amazing how many people do recognize and give you credit for supporting Ukraine. The people who are left are people who are committed. Okay, they knew that their life was on the line, but they feel a closeness. They're not going to allow these people who simply sat on the surf in France or went off on vacation all over Europe, and very little for Ukraine. And they're going to be making choices based upon, well, what did you do during the war? And they will insist upon those answers being provided. And they have to be publicly available. I'm convinced that this will be put out there by civic organizations. And if you can't show that you either stayed behind and were willing to go out and were willing to stay Ukrainian, rather than immediately change sides to the Russians once they came in, but continue to be quiet and silent, but decided to hang on to your homeland, you're going to have a new government take shape. And that government is going to be a heck of an improvement over any and all of the governments we'd have up to this point. Now, I personally think extremely highly of Zelensky. Don't get me wrong. I'm not one of these guys who's quietly saying Zelensky. I think he's going to go down in the history books, possibly as the George Washington that Taras Shevchenko spoke about when he said, "When will we receive our George Washington?" Okay? I think Zelensky will fit that bill, even if the war finally ends under conditions which we may all find in some respects regrettable. You have only so many people, and if you run out of people, you better decide when you're going to go ahead. I see a tremendous, tremendous future for Ukraine. I see that Ukraine will not only become one of the most powerful countries in Europe, but will become the one that takes Europe out of its sleepy hollow. And I see anybody who from the diaspora who goes to Ukraine, my only regret, Damien, my only regret is that I'm 82 and in a few months I'll be 83. Now I'm still have a lot of mojo left, so don't get me wrong. But the point is that anybody who goes to Ukraine, once the war stops, they're going to have the opportunity to make fantastic careers for themselves if that's what they want to do. And I want people to hear this. Look at what's waiting for us here in the U.S. AI is coming, and AI is ready to dismiss a lot of people, and there'll be a lot of people on the unemployment line. And look what's going to be happening in Ukraine. Look at its incredible riches. It's probably the richest piece of real estate on earth, the richest piece of real estate on earth, with a people who will have shown how tough they are and the stamina and the dedication and commitment. If I could reverse the clock by 5 or 10 years, I would be out there right now developing my own future and career. If that's the way you want to go. For me, it's a matter of building Ukraine. And you know where Ukraine should go to be able to find the best models to build its own state. They should go to the Nordic states, any of the Nordic states. Don't copy the U.S. The U.S. has huge problems that it hasn't solved, which it could solve, but it hasn't solved. The U.S. now is looking like it's increasingly less likely to solve the problems that it has had, and when it had a chance to do so. Certainly, if you look at nothing less than the national debt, you'll see that it's been very difficult for the U.S. to be able to both have what it wants, solve its problems, and so forth. I would say don't look to the U.S. as a model. Besides, if a guy like Trump comes along, you're standing a real risk of losing your democracy, losing your traditions, losing all those things that made this country great and desirable and the shining city on the hill, to quote Ronald Reagan. Okay? So what's the point of following that model? Just because it's big and says, I'm the greatest? No. Go to the countries that others will tell you are too socialist. They're going to tax the heck out of you. Nobody explains to you that you have to go out, if you're a smart guy, you have to get insurance policies against everything. It's a country where you never know what's going to happen, and they're all going to come if they see any opportunity to make a fortune off you and so on. Why is it that the socialist countries, yes, their tax rate is somewhat higher than the U.S., but are they having to go out and buy and save for their kids' education? They have to go out and buy insurance in case they're disabled and can't work. In other words, look at what they're getting in terms of benefits. And they decided that I'd rather go ahead and pay the taxes and be free of all these anxieties that the average American has. I bet you that half the people in the United States right now have a real anxiety as to whether they're going to be the ones who are going to stand what they're reading about in terms of AI only beginning. Certainly, the first 5 to 10 years, the whole country will be getting out of the swamp that it's finds itself. The mines, the military equipment, the ruined agricultural fields, all of that is going to be building back. They'll be looking for people. The problem Ukraine has is a labor shortage. Yes, it's picking up on its military production side, but the country can survive indefinitely just by having a good military production. There'll be other countries that will come in with superior products, even if Ukrainians have been the first in that field. you got to have a diversified economy. You've got to have your scientists, your first class doctors, and so on. Ukraine is the real Wild West of the world, and by Wild West I mean it in a good sense, where you can go out, go west, young man. That's what Ukraine is going to be. The problem is we don't want too many people flocking into Ukraine, which means we should try to tempt or induce or offer the diaspora and people who have left Ukraine recently as well as in the past to come back, so that we don't have to rely on some Vietnamese laborers coming in and doing the work, or Turkish road builders. So they're going to be. There'll be plenty. There'll be a lot of money as well, because I think the world now recognizes something it never recognized or even knew, and that was the potential of Ukraine. If it's just the natural resources, that's enough to lure a huge number of investors. But then you also have the people. You have the brilliance that they've shown. You talk to any Ukrainian who comes over, any Ukrainian child who comes from a Ukrainian school, you'll get a good dialogue. It's a land of the future, not of the past.
Бо наша воля, то є наша кров, повітря нашої сили джерело, свободи сонце більше не за.